This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Last week, Megan Messerly ended up somewhere a little strange for a healthcare policy reporter, a religious convention. It was the Southern Baptists' annual gathering, this year in Indianapolis.
This is the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. And a very politically powerful denomination. There's members of Congress, Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, Mike Johnson, all Southern Baptists. And so this is a denomination with a lot of heft and a lot of sway.
Megan reports for Politico, so you can see why she'd want to show up.
And I heard that they would be bringing forward this resolution, essentially opposing in vitro fertilization. And this is something I've been covering for quite a bit of time.
Did everyone know this was coming?
No. I don't think that they knew it was coming. Some folks I even approached in the convention halls, they'd maybe heard that there was a resolution coming on IVF, but hadn't fully read the whole thing.
To be clear, it was not the politicians bringing this resolution forward. It was church leadership. And on Wednesday, thousands of church representatives, they call themselves messengers, put reproductive technology up to a vote.
My name's Kristen Ferguson from 11th Street Baptist Church in Upland, California, and I move that the convention adopt resolution number 6 on the ethical realities of reproductive technologies and the dignity of the human embryo.
Picture a massive convention hall filled with people with little cards in their hands that they use to vote yay or nay. And anyone can get up to speak.
It was pretty emotional. There was one man who came forward. He was from an Ohio church, and he had actually had a son through IVF.
I have a son because of IVF. I have another son, 20 weeks old, in my wife's womb because of IVF. And I have 10 embryos that I love, and with every bit of my being, we will have or see born into a Christian family. And no one can stop us from making that disposition. I am for the sanctity of life and for the sanctity of embryos. I am against the idea that this technology is so wicked that it cannot be employed. And so,
after listening to a couple of these stories, each messenger had a choice to make.
We now are at the question on the adoption of the resolution. As many as are in favor of adopting the resolution, would you indicate by lifting your ballots?
Seeing the flags go up in the air, it was still overwhelmingly in support of this, resolution opposing IVF. But you could tell that, there were a lot of folks that weren't exactly sure. It wasn't like they were just throwing their cards up in the air immediately. They were definitely giving some thought to this.
The ayes have it, and the resolution is adopted.
The people behind this resolution had anticipated a certain ambivalence here. Megan says the text of this resolution basically builds a step-by-step case for why IVF is biblically wrong. This argument is that embryos are human beings from the moment of fertilization. Some people call this an argument for fetal personhood. The resolution is also non-binding, basically a conversation starter for Southern Baptist churches all over the country. The expectation is that now the work of changing minds is going to begin.
Exactly. And a lot of the folks that I talk to who, do have concerns about IVF, they've been thinking about this for a long time, but they see this as the beginning of another, decades-long push like there was on abortion. This is like a long campaign to change hearts and minds, and ultimately changing those hearts and minds at sort of the congregation level, they hope will affect change in the halls of Congress and in state houses across the country, right?
A progressive might call it shifting the Overton window.
Yep, exactly.
Today on the show, how and why evangelicals are beginning to make the case against IVF. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Washington Wise. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear stories making news right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen.
It's hard to imagine a world where we leave future generations with fewer rights and freedoms. The Supreme Court has stolen the constitutional right to control our bodies. Now, politicians in nearly every state have introduced bills that would block people from getting the essential sexual and reproductive care they need, including abortion. Planned Parenthood believes everyone deserves access to care. It's a human right. We won't give up, and we won't back down. Help ensure the next generation can decide their own futures. Donate to Planned Parenthood. Visit plannedparenthood.org/future.
Can we talk about the pathway that the Southern Baptist Convention took to this IVF vote in the first place? The church has not had a clear stance on IVF before now, has it?
No, they haven't. So they've spoken out, obviously, a lot on the abortion issue. They've spoken out previously on other reproductive technologies, but this is the first time they explicitly spoke out on IVF directly. You know, these resolutions can come up every year on various topics where the SBC can sort of take a position or take a stance. And so essentially this resolution was brought forward to a committee. The committee itself decided this was worthwhile to bring forward to the full convention body. So the fact that it even made it to the floor is very notable.
It's interesting because I read that the theologian who proposed this statement published an anti-IVF argument in a church publication, an ethics publication, a few years back and got a lot of criticism for it.
Yeah. So both of the resolution sponsors, so Albert Mohler and Andrew Walker, both of them had been writing on IVF for quite some time. But it really is the Alabama Supreme Court decision that they said created the space for this conversation.
And just to remind the listener, like this Alabama Supreme Court decision, it basically ruled that embryos were people. They were human life.
Correct.
And the Chief Justice, in his opinion, warned that human life cannot be wrongfully destroyed without incurring the wrath of a holy God, which is pretty intense. This was a suit that came forward because a couple of families, their embryos were destroyed when there was a mistake in how they were stored. Is that right?
Correct. Yep. That's exactly why. And it's sort of the case itself sort of came out of left field. I mean, even folks in the anti-abortion movement, people really were not, they did not have their eye on this decision. So sort of this specter of IVF coming up in sort of a national debate context really wasn't on folks' radar.
It took me by surprise. And right away, when this decision came out that had this fetal personhood effect, essentially, you know, Alabama's legislature was getting involved. They were intervening to offer civil and criminal immunity to IVF service providers to avoid the fertility industry totally collapsing in the state. And I look at that and I think like, this lawsuit was not successful by any traditional metrics. Like it seems like people responded right away to shut down what happened here. So I guess I'm kind of surprised that these ethicists at the Southern Baptist Convention looked at this and was like, okay, now's our time to get into it with IVF.
Totally. No, I think it's a fair point. But at the same time, I think the fact that there was a conversation around IVF, I mean, it got a lot of people thinking about like, okay, what are the implications for IVF, right? After the Dobbs decision came down, there, or a lot of folks on the left saying like, oh, it's, abortion today, but it's contraception and IVF tomorrow. And I think a lot of folks on the right dismiss that as sort of fear-mongering. On the other hand, there are, again, folks on the right, conservatives, and a lot of evangelical folks who've been thinking about this for a long time and who said, no, that really is where we want to go with this. We do have concerns with IVF. We do have concerns with certain forms of contraception. I mean, when I was in Indianapolis, I talked to a handful of people who actually were from Alabama, and I asked them, what were people talking about? And I talked to this wife of a pastor, and she was telling me, like, in her ladies' small group, like right after the decision came down, they were talking about like what the implications were for IVF and them talking about the ethics of it and saying, okay, we do believe that, embryos are people and we believe that fetuses are people. So I guess we do have concerns with IVF.
So they were changing their minds like midstream.
In real time. Yeah, in real time. And saying, I've been so vehemently opposed to abortion, I guess I need to be opposed to IVF as it's commonly practiced in the U.S.
I mean, you've noted that some of the people you spoke to at the Southern Baptist Convention meeting, they basically were very plain and said it took us half a century to take down Roe v. Wade. And, we're on year one right now with IVF. It may take us just as long. And that was interesting to me because it left me with this question, like, with abortion, did it really work in this same way? Like evangelical churches were led by their pastors to a cultural stance that they may not have had before on abortion. And then those leaders took their parishioners' concerns to Washington. Like, was that the way it went down?
I mean, there's some interesting parallels. It's not a perfect like one-to-one corollary, but going back to abortion, Catholics had long opposed abortion, way ahead of evangelicals and Protestants broadly. And then evangelicals came along around, Roe and the time of the moral majority. Like this really became an issue for evangelicals. Like they could sort of take up and champion the cause. And even the Southern Baptists, many, many years ago, they didn't have an official position. And then they took one, right? And so we saw this become like a core tenet of, what evangelical churches were talking about. And, I talked to many pastors at the meeting in Indianapolis, and they were saying, yeah, I routinely preach, once a year I preach on abortion and why it's a problem. I don't preach on IVF. But there was a time when, pastors weren't preaching on that. So a lot of the folks that I'm talking to are sort of hoping this is the time now for IVF to have, that similar conversation, to have that same kind of inflection point.
After the Alabama's Supreme Court decision that started all this, it was interesting for me to examine more closely the kinds of arguments that Christian conservatives were beginning to make about IVF. Like in the weeks after the decision, Mike Pence, the former vice president, wrote this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. And he essentially said IVF is an unregulated industry. And he went through exactly what happened in Alabama that led to this lawsuit. Like a random patient was able to access embryos and destroy them. And he's like, listen, there's no security here. Like, you shouldn't be able to touch a nitrogen tank with frozen embryos if you're stumbling into a room in a hospital. That shouldn't be how it works. He also made this argument from a perspective of someone who has used fertility treatments because he and his wife did that. And it struck me that his argument kind of made sense. Like, if you've touched the fertility industry, you know that it is expensive and there will be a moment where you feel a little scammed. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was like, I was like, you're making like an argument that seems logical to me. And that interested me.
I mean, the argument about regulation, and I think this is what, folks who are pushing this conversation and who want to have this conversation, I mean, they believe that there's a bipartisan argument to be made there to say, yes, there should be more regulations and restrictions. And they point to the way that IVF is regulated in Europe. Generally it is. Many countries there do have stricter regulations, not just as far as physical, safety of the clinics or whatever, how things are protected, but also just in terms of how many embryos you can create at once. Like, they see that as a model, but they also see it as something that they really think they can eventually persuade enough folks to support. Because again, like you mentioned, so many families, use fertility treatments, and families have a lot of attachment to their embryos and don't want to see them destroyed. And so, sort of whether or not you're going to say that that's human life or what have you, there's a lot of folks who could probably, get behind there being more protections and regulations on the industry.
Yeah. And this Alabama case, it's not the last case like it in which an IVF patient sues to have their embryos declared children. Like there was this case in Texas that got appealed to the Texas Supreme Court and they rejected it. But in that case, a couple had signed a contract saying that if they divorced, their embryos would go to the husband, and they were divorcing. And the wife was not thrilled that her embryos were becoming the property of her ex, which, again, I understand this argument. I can understand being in this position. I cannot understand making it into a fetal personhood argument, but I can understand the desires at play here, I guess.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. Like even for folks who are saying, no, I'm not sure that these frozen embryos are people. You can still see there's still an argument to be made that no, I don't want them to be randomly destroyed. I would be upset if that happened. Or no, I don't want to get into a custody battle, over my frozen embryos. There's a broader sort of application here for folks even sort of outside these religious spaces, saying, okay, how do we treat these embryos, right? Like who gets to say what happens with them? Whose are they, right? It brings up a lot of sort of interesting ethical arguments, even for folks who aren't thinking about this in sort of a religious, life begins at conception kind of space.
Yeah. It was also an interesting argument because of that Texas case. I was like, hold it. The implication of the lawsuit here is that you don't want there to be children from these embryos. However, if you're declaring them fetal people, I don't see how they are not, like, at least tried to become, you know what I'm saying? Like, there was a lot of confusing stuff in there.
Exactly. Well, and that's gets to this broader point of so many states, more than a third of states have laws on their books either saying that embryos or fetuses at some point, during pregnancy are people and should have personhood protections, just as you and I do. And that poses a lot of complications, right? A lot of those laws were passed as states were passing anti-abortion laws, but now there's just sort of all these other consequences of, okay, what does that mean for IVF? There's just all these sort of knock-on effects from those laws that maybe some lawmakers were thinking about that when they were making these laws, but a lot of state lawmakers, I can guarantee, I was talking to them after the Alabama court decision, and they had not thought about the implications of saying that embryos are people for, IVF. And so everyone, I think, is just now starting to grapple with, okay, what exactly does that mean in practice now?
After the break, evangelicals have been reliable supporters of Republicans over the years. So is the GOP ready to reject IVF too? This episode is brought to you by Discover. When it comes to your finances, Discover wants you to know they are the credit card that is always there for you. With 24/7 U.S.-based live customer service, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We are talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. This episode is brought to you by Discover. When it comes to your finances, Discover wants you to know they are the credit card that is always there for you. With 24/7 U.S.-based live customer service, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We are talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. Let's talk about the pressure Republicans are now facing when it comes to IVF. Because polling shows that a vast majority of Americans, like 80% more, support IVF. So what does that mean for a Republican Party that has relied on the evangelical vote and that sees this movement in this voting bloc towards rethinking IVF?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is the $1 million question is how do Republican lawmakers start to shift on this issue, and do they start to shift, and how quickly?
So far, they do not seem to be shifting.
No, they do not seem to be shifting. In fact, they've largely just been sort of doubling down on their support for IVF, right? Republican senators, signing on last week, literally their signatures on a piece of paper saying we support IVF. We're not trying to ban it.
This is all 49 Senate Republicans. This is like across the board.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a complicated issue for them in this election cycle where Democrats are trying to say that Republicans are extreme on abortion and other reproductive health issues, whether it's IVF or contraception. They're in a politically tricky spot. They have very clear views on abortion. Many of them haven't thought through fully the ethical implications of IVF and whether or not they do or do not support it. And so a lot of them are looking at the polling, and just running scared. 86% of Americans support IVF. This is a very popular treatment. A lot of people have friends or family who've used it. And so it's a really complicated issue for them to message on.
It's been increasingly difficult for Republicans to toe the line here with their messaging. The same day that all 49 Senate Republicans signed that statement saying they supported access to IVF, most of them voted against a bill introduced by Senate Democrats that would have guaranteed access to fertility treatments and even mandated insurers pay for it. Republicans have introduced legislation of their own that would cut off Medicaid funding for states that ban in vitro fertilization. But it leaves the sticky questions of fetal personhood unaddressed.
Republicans have really been in this uncomfortable position of, wanting to say that they express broad support for IVF, but saying, no, the Democratic legislation goes too far in protecting access to reproductive technologies, and we can't see all the implications of that legislation. It's too sweeping.
To the best of my knowledge, all 100 senators in this body support IVF. Seeing this confusion that unfortunately has been fueled by Democrat partisans, I reached out to Senator
I think Republicans see that opposing that Democratic legislation is a way for them to, in some ways, appease the parts of their base that would like to see them be more vocal on IVF, but at the same time be able to still, put out that, statement saying they support IVF, and all, 49 Republican senators sign onto it. So they're sort of in some ways trying to have their cake and eat it too on IVF, but at some point they're sort of being backed into a corner here.
Yeah. Is anyone holding each Republican's feet to the fire to be like, what do you think about fetal personhood? What do you think about regulating IVF? Those sorts of things. Are they just slipping through reporters and other people's fingers because they're running scared from this issue?
Yeah, I think so far it's been more the latter. Even House Speaker Mike Johnson wouldn't say whether he thought the destruction of frozen embryos was murder.
But there's this question of embryos. In the process, they are destroyed, disposed of. If you believe life begins at conception, fertilization, and I know you do you see that as murder?
It's something that we've got to grapple with. It's a brave new world. IVF's only been invented, I think, in the early 70s. But there's an estimated 8 million Americans who have been born.
And again, Mike Johnson, Southern Baptist, he's a former trustee of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is the SBC's public policy arm.
So these are his people.
These are his people, yeah, and they're telling him, and telling members of Congress that they are concerned about IVF, and yet you see, even someone like Mike Johnson really not know how to talk about this publicly.
Yeah, one of the few politicians who seems to have really thought this through is former Vice President Mike Pence.
Yes,
because he talks about going through fertility treatment with his wife, and they actually avoided IVF. Specifically because they were Catholics at the time and they knew that the Catholic Church was not in favor of IVF. They did a much more invasive procedure where the woman has to be out. It's like surgical, and you put the sperm and the egg in the fallopian tube and sort of hope that they figure it out, as opposed to making an embryo outside of the womb. And I can't imagine he's not going to be a messenger basically saying, well, I did it. Anyone can. But if you look at what he did, it's way more invasive than what people have done today.
It is. Yeah, it's very invasive. And I think a lot of people don't even, you don't get into the weeds, right, about sort of what exactly fertility treatment means, right? You know, that someone went through IVF or they're going through fertility treatments. But yeah, there are ways around IVF, what the Pences used, and that's what folks I'm talking to are hoping more folks move in that direction. On the other hand, there's a cost to that, whether it's financial, whether it's medical, literally having to be out for a procedure.
If I was a Republican, I think I would want this IVF issue to just go away. I would just want to wake up and no one asks me about IVF. But in addition to the Southern Baptist Convention stuff that we saw last week, there is another reminder that this isn't just going away, because the couples who filed that Alabama lawsuit filed another lawsuit.
I think in general, this idea that this issue isn't going away is a good one. I mean, Republicans in this election wish that IVF would go away. They wish that abortion would go away. I mean, these are not things they want to be talking about on the campaign trail. They're not good issues for them. And yet at the same time, abortion is something their party has been talking about for decades. IVF is something that a chunk of their base, an influential part of their base at least, is starting to move in that direction on. And so as much as they want to avoid it, they're not going to be able to. And there are going to be cases that keep coming up, whether in Alabama or, again, in these states that have laws on their books saying that, embryos that are people, fetuses at every stage of pregnancy are people. There are going to be lawsuits that put those state laws to the test. A lot of the states in the South, for instance, that have very strong anti-abortion laws, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Texas, right? These are states that have laws on their books saying that at every stage of pregnancy, embryos, fetuses are people. And so really any of those states are just a lawsuit away from being in the same situation that Alabama was in. And then, we might see Supreme Courts make similar rulings to the ones that the Alabama Supreme Court made.
Megan, I'm grateful for your time and for your reporting. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Megan Messerly is a health policy reporter over at Politico. And that's the show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Anna Phillips. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with a little boost from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.